Okay, there we go. Okay, and then we go to this. Move that a minute. Is that you, David?
No, this is Andy.
I'm sorry, Andy. That was my last call. How are you?
I'm okay. Who is this?
It's Tina. I'm sorry. I'll be right there. I'll just 1 second. I'll be right with you.
Okay, no rush.
Did you get your doctor's appointment done?
I did. It was very quick and easy, except for the temperature. I drive a convertible, so when I drove over there, and they did the forehead scan, it registered 102.
Oh my God.
So we had to wait like 5 minutes inside in the air conditioning before it would revert to a normal temperature.
Oh dear. All right. Now let me just get back. Where do I have the Zoom camera? And we'll just set that up. I was over at Buncombe Health Services getting vaccinations today, and it's just
Huh?
amazing how, I mean, it's good how conservative they're being, all the different precautions that they had throughout the building. I felt like I was entering Fort Knox.
What kind of vaccinations?
Well, one was just flu, and then the other one was shingles.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Just standard, yeah, not COVID.
Right.
I use Clorox for that. What a, well, we won't even go there. All right, I'm set. So before I turn on and oh, it is recording. Well, that's okay. I'll cut off the beginning of it. How would you like to conduct this? I mean, I've got questions, but I want to do this around the narrative you want to tell. So were there things that you wanted?
Well, I guess I would, my view would be that I moved back home in the early 90s after many years away in New York. And that happened to coincide with a period of activism in Asheville. And so I got involved with some of that for the next 7 to 10 years.
So moving back is a good thing to key in on.
Yeah, I guess so.
Right. Okay. Um, and anything else?
Uh, no, I don't think so. I
Okay.
mean, just the fact that I'm a native here, and so um, I perceive quite a change when I returned from when I had left.
Oh, I'd loved it. And then were you, another thing where people have things to share, we've had a lot of institutions that have come and gone that 15 and 20 years ago were, I guess, cornerstones of the LGBT community at the time. And so I love to get people to give any color commentary on any of those.
Sure.
Because I don't, one of the other things we want to do is to try to build a history of, separately, of just some of those institutions. Do you know Jerry Connor?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, no, so he's gotten me turned on to that. He and Rosie, just when you just wind them up and they just talk about, I sort of have this vision of creating a guided tour, self-guided tour of downtown Asheville, and just because he'd point, and say, well, that was run by two lesbians who did this, and then it was just fascinating. But okay. So what we'll do is I'll just open with a brief formal introduction, which is more just to, and I'm just looking for I just had it in front of me. Where'd it go? 1, 3, 4. Here it is. Okay. Or I'll just be teeing it up. Do you want to be known for purpose of the interview as Andy?
Yes.
Andy Perry? Okay.
No, Andy Reid. That's okay.
Yeah. And
Now there's another piece that I need to talk
yeah.
to you about. Are you recording now?
Well, let me turn it off. I just don't let me forget to turn it back on.
Okay.
I did that once and it was very embarrassing. Resume recording. Okay. Well, let's get this show started. Okay, today's date is September the 4th, 2020. My name is Tina Madison White, and I am talking with Andy Reid, who was born, Andy, you were born in Asheville, right?
Right, Mission Hospital.
Mission Hospital. And Andy's preferred pronouns are he, him, and his. And he has been living in Asheville. When did you move back?
93.
93. Okay, well, we'll get into that more. Well, let's begin. Andy, let me just start with a basic question. How do you like to describe yourself when you're telling your story? Where do you start?
Well, I don't ever tell my story or start by describing myself as a gay man. I've been out for, gosh, 50 years this year. But I have been an Asheville person in general involvement in life for most of my life. And being gay has never been the defining feature of who I am or what I do. And that started early on. So I don't know if you want that sort of backstory for that.
Sure, this is your story. Sure.
Okay. Well, then I'm going to give a brief overview of my life. Left Asheville in 1970 when I finished high school. I was just 16 when I graduated. and I went to New York to go to Columbia University, where my brother went, my cousins went. So I moved to New York City right after my 17th birthday. And it was 1970, a year after Stonewall. So my freshman year at college, I was fairly low key and just doing freshman stuff. But at the beginning of sophomore year, I came out, and it was a surprisingly easy process, because New York at the time, 1970, I guess it was January of 72 when that happened. I had a close friend who was from New Orleans, and she attended Barnard College, part of Columbia. And I decided to come out to her when I was still I thought I was in the closet. And we spent several hours just chatting and drinking Southern Comfort and talking about life. And finally I said, after a lot of hemming and hawing, I have a big secret to tell you, blah, 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 blah. I'm gay. And her response was the last thing I expected. I thought she'd say, oh gosh, I'm so glad you told me. She laughed and she said, well, Andy, everybody knew that. We've been talking about you and Andrew Bittern, and you've secret dating for the last year. And I was like, what? It doesn't bother you? And she said, heck no, everybody knows you're gay. Nobody cares. And that was my coming out. And so I never had the kind of repercussions that a lot of people underwent, thrown out by your family, disowned by your siblings, any of that crap. And so after college, when I went to work, I was openly gay from the outset. I figured they have to know, and I'm not going to make a secret of it. And after a few years in different jobs, starting off a career, I ended up at NBC Television and was in the marketing area of advertising sales. And I put a picture of my boyfriend on my desk. And my boss, who was a retired Navy guy from Newport News, Virginia, and he was hetero and a half. He was screwing around with every female he could find, and he was about 50 at the time and married and had grown kids, but he just was a randy kind of guy. And he came over to my desk one day and saw the picture of my boyfriend and said, who's that? And I said, that's my boyfriend, Ron. And he said, oh, hell. Well, shit. All right, whatever. And that was that there. So that part of life became such an unimportant norm for me. It was not something that I had to go around parading. It was just, this is my boyfriend, this is your girlfriend, nice to meet you, and so forth. Well, after 22 years in New York, I came back to Asheville in 93, and I brought the same attitude with me, that there was nothing shameful or secret or embarrassing or super important about it. I was just coming back because my mom was ill and she was dying, and I was going to resettle back home. And so when I did, again, it was just something like, I've got blue eyes and I'm right-handed and my hair is thinning and I have a boyfriend and I live in my old family home and I'm a writer and editor. It was just part of who I was without any big deal about it. So that is how I approached it, as a very integrated part of my life. And then, Asheville at the time was going through the very beginnings of Pride. The first Pride parade, I think, had been in the late 80s. And my mom marched in it, as a matter of fact. she called me and said, "Oh, I'm going to march in Pride Parade in Asheville because you won't be here." And in those days, there was a Pride Parade, North Carolina Pride, held a parade every year in June, I think, in commemoration of Stonewall. But they did it in a different city every year. So it would be Greensboro one year, and Wilmington, and Raleigh, and Asheville, and Charlotte, and Winston-Salem, every year a different city. Excuse me. And so the year it was in Asheville, my mom proudly marched in it. And so, that became the tenor of how I lived here. But I will say that because in New York, I had a very wide circle of friends. I always have. I'm a fairly sociable person, and I get my fingers in a lot of pies. Most of what I was involved in had nothing to do with GLBT stuff. It was voter rights, it was equal rights, it was civil rights, Medicare, medical care rights, things like that. Political in a lot of cases and cultural in a lot of cases, but not necessarily focused on the GLBTQ community. In fact, I was probably much more involved in the Black community as an activist for equal rights there than I was for the gay community. And I think in part it was because the gay community had all these people like Jerry Connor and Jim Kavanagh, other leaders who were taking care of things. My value was greater in other communities that didn't have lots of leaders already or that needed allies. But I remember my first Christmas here, at Christmas of '93, after I had formally moved down. I had been here since January of that year. My first Christmas, I sent Christmas cards to all my friends back in New York. And again, it was probably 50 or 60 cards back there. And at the time, I remember telling them all that I had met more gay and lesbian people in Asheville than I had known in New York City. And it was because in this smaller community that sub-community was more visible. And my life in New York had been so involved with other stuff in my job, career, television, and all that, that there wasn't a lot of room in my life for a big circle of gay and lesbian friends. But here, what I discovered very quickly was that there were four very distinct subcultures of gay people in Asheville. And I learned that right away. There were people like me who were white, upper middle class, well-educated, sophisticated, people involved in their, mainstream progressive movements or congregations like the Unitarian Universalist Church, which was mine, and All Souls, and First United Congregational. They were people who had access, who could pick up the phone and call a city councilman, who could walk into the mayor's office and the mayor greeted them by name. People who were, part of Asheville's, not elite, but certainly part of Asheville's structure. And there were both men and women in that situation. But then there were also the mostly white boys who had come to Asheville as the big city from Graham County and Cherokee and Rutherford, because they were thrown out of their homes by their families, or they were effeminate and lived out there and were beat up in high school. And they came to Asheville as a place of refuge. They were often homeless. They were often, working the streets, walking around the Grove Arcade to, pick up tricks and stuff like that. They didn't have access to city council. They didn't have any connections or money or nice homes. It was a whole subset or stratum of country boys who were just struggling to find their way and find a place for themselves. And then among the women, I noticed that there were the elite, the people like Jerry Goldberg and people like that, and what used to be called lipstick lesbians, lesbian couples at the churches, at UU Church and elsewhere, who had good careers and jobs and income and homes. And outside of that group, there were the country girls and the women who worked on farms or I had a landscaper, a woman who took care of my garden and my yard work. And she was bulky and strong and showed up with all her tools and everything. And she was more of a guy than I was. And again, she too had no connections with the movers and shakers of the community. And I noticed that very early on, that Asheville already, even as early as the early 1990s, had at least 4 distinct groups of GLBTQ residents who almost never interacted. And I thought that was astounding for a place like this. But Asheville at the time was a mecca for all the surrounding counties because it was much bigger than any other town in Western North Carolina. And so it had opportunities, or at least a place where people from the outer counties and from the rural areas could come and feel safe, or at least hidden. So that's my take on Asheville circa 1993.
So you've really seen our history unfold since then. I'd be curious, I'm a relative newcomer, so I only know sort of the modern prides. How would you compare prides to the ages in Asheville or North Carolina?
Well, I only attended Pride festivals and the march about, I would guess, no more than 3 times during the late 90s and into the 2000s. And when I did, I often was with not a GLBT group per se, but say the congregation of UU Asheville, the Unitarian Universalist Church at the time. Now it's the UU congregation. And that brings in that I was very involved with that church. I grew up in the church. I was one of those born UUs in Asheville. The church was founded in Asheville, or the Asheville Church was established in 1950, and I was born into it in 53. So it was my religious background. And in the mid-90s, we participated in the National Unitarian Universalist Association's Welcoming Congregation program, which was specifically designed to get congregations to be welcoming and open to the GLBT community and not shame people and not have bars or hindrances, but to say, we welcome everybody. And the minister at the time was very positive and progressive and almost pushy about it, which was great. and she tapped me to co-chair that program at the time. And so we would have 50 people from the UU Church, 45 of whom were heterosexuals, marching in the Pride Parade when it was held in Asheville, I think like 97 or 98 around then, and maybe 2000. So it would be a contingent of people from that church being allies, and some members of the congregation who were GLBT would be part of that, but it would not be the gay contingent from the church. It would be the church standing with. And that became a very important part of certainly some aspects of Asheville religious life, because there were only a few other churches that would even consider being welcoming that way. First Congregational did, and All Souls had a very active program for GLBT youth, particularly. Joan and Dan, I'm going blank on their last name. Joan was a, whatever it's called, a deacon at the church. And I think she might have been the first female deacon, and her husband, Dan, was a lay member of the congregation. But they led a program for, it was generally for the entire gay community, but it also was specifically designed to give the runaways and the homeless and the people who were thrown out of their family homes, the same ones who had come to Asheville for a haven. It was designed to give them a shelter and a haven and opportunities to get a little bit more stabilized and settled and centered. And I got involved with that pretty early on, about 94, 95, because I started singing with what was then the Asheville Gay Men's Chorus. And it was housed at All Souls. And so I think around 94 or 95, I joined the chorus as a tenor and sang with them for a number of years. And we rehearsed at All Souls and met there. And so that got me involved in their gay outreach program. I can't remember what it was called. But it became sort of a community center in fact, if not in name, for a lot of different gay groups that wanted to have a home or a place to meet. They made their campus available. And at the same time, the Unitarian Church on Charlotte Street in North Asheville had hosted the Metropolitan Community Church starting in the 90s, because it was, the gay Christian congregation. And we were the only congregation that was either willing or that also had space for them to come in and hold their services on Wednesday evenings. And so we rented our church to them. In the same way, All Souls made its community building available for different groups to participate in. So both those congregations did a lot to not just to welcome, but to ensure that the gay communities in Asheville could find a home and were not exiled, were not banished, were not constantly disparaged, and particularly for people who had particular faiths, or who had theistic beliefs, and who would have been thrown out of their Baptist or Methodist or Presbyterian churches in Rutherford County or in Haywood County even, or Marshall, they could come here and find that community that they were looking for here as well. And if it was something to do with non-faith issues, like just wanting to be safe or wanting to go back to school and get a GED, but not having any money, they could go to All Souls, and Dan and Joan would probably be able to find them some sort of job that could bring in some money so that they could afford to share an apartment and then sign up for a GED program. So a lot of that was going on in the early 90s.
Do you, so again, if you talked about back in the 90s, both men and women, there were groups that were sort of, you didn't use the word underclass, but there were not privileged, that were struggling. We have that problem today. And I was just curious, is it just the same issue that's still repeating itself, or do you see any differences for people under 30 in terms of the issues that they're facing?
Well, I'm not involved at all in those issues or in those activities nowadays. So I don't know what the situation is for people of that background nowadays. My suspicion is that it's simply that nothing has changed. In the same way that Black families still have to teach their boys, that give them the talk. They used to give them the talk when they were 11 or 12. My black friends who have kids now give them the talk at 7. So that has been an ongoing issue for 50 years or more in that community, and I suspect the underclass or the less privileged people who come here to Asheville still are coming from outlying counties where they're finding or facing the same discrimination and the same negative reaction. From time to time, you read a story about, how XYZ school in Haywood County has a gay and gay-friendly student group, and even a couple of football players are members of it. But those same football players, if they're out with their buddies drinking on a Friday night, are going to beat up a fag. So I suspect that the same dynamic is still at work. But I don't know what's going on in Asheville in terms of the homeless or homeless gay kids or youth prostitution or anything like that, the way it was 25 years ago.
The way you've described your life, it sounds more comfortable. Your transition and your ability to navigate the world was more comfortable than many other people's experiences. Do you ever feel fear when you go out into the community or engage in certain activities or travel, or do you generally just feel very at ease?
No, I am the embodiment of white male privilege. I mean, I grew up with parents who encouraged me and my brother and sister to make our own choices in life and decide what major we wanted in college and what career we want to have. We were taught to be independent thinkers from the time we were small. And we were given the tools to do that because our parents had education. So, if we asked what a word meant, they'd say, look it up, and we had a dictionary. In a lot of families, probably in 50% of the households in Buncombe County, there is no dictionary in the house. So even that simple kind of tool, look it up. Look it up for yourself. Find out for yourself. Make your decision for yourself. Those are all little tools that children get or don't get, or they have the the desire but don't have the tool or the opportunity. We didn't have a lot of money. I mean, my parents were not wealthy. We weren't from Beaver Lake or Biltmore Forest, but we had education and an attitude that the world was what we made of it. And so I was very fortunate that way. And in my choice of friends and people that I would spend time with, that was a choice I made, but it also was part of my personality that I would attract people who had open minds and intelligence and progressive attitudes. So, I mean, one time I was attacked in Washington Square Park in New York, and I was about, I guess, 28 at the time. So this would have been in 1981, and there were roving bands of Irish, Catholic, New Jersey, white teenage assholes who would come to New York and look for fags to beat up. And I was walking through Washington Square with my boyfriend, holding hands. And this group of them started attacking us in the middle of the afternoon. And I fought back like hell and landed some punches. And my boyfriend was able to get over and call a cop, and he came and arrested the kids. And I didn't have any fear of them or of being attacked that way. What I had was a reaction of outrage and great satisfaction when they were hauled off to jail for the weekend. And when the case came up for a first hearing the following, I guess it was the following Wednesday, and I showed up at court, the judge, who was this fairly conservative kind of crusty old guy from Brooklyn, said that he was so disgusted by the behavior of these kids and so glad that what their attack had happened, I guess it was on a Friday afternoon, that they had to spend the whole weekend in jail, and there wasn't even a hearing to give them bail until after the weekend. So they had to call their parents and explain why they were in jail in New York City and possibly headed for the Tombs. And he turned to them and their families, who were, like Archie Bunker. And he turned to them and sort of pointed at me and said, "This young man has more courage and more strength of character than all your four boys combined. And he has agreed to not press charges, but they will be on probation, I guess, or parole for a full year." They were age 17 and 18 or something. "And you parents are responsible for them. But Mr. Reed thinks that they might have learned enough by spending 4 days in jail and 4 nights in jail to maybe it will count as a good kick in the butt, and they'll straighten up their lives. Because frankly, Mr. Joe, Mr. so-and-so, whatever their last names were, your kids are a mess and it's your fault." And so, that was the only bad incident that I ever had in terms of a repercussion for being openly gay, for being public about it. And even that, I mean, it was like, I'm not going to let this screw up my life. So here in Asheville, no, I don't feel any of those fears or concerns. On the other hand, I think that if I were had a different persona, if I were very flamboyant, if I were in drag, if I were transsexual, if I were just, more effeminate as a gay man, there might be more response, even if it was whispered from, a cashier at Ingles or what have you. but that's something I've never had to deal with. So I don't know if that would be true or not.
Okay. And one, in your years in Asheville, were there any LGBTQ institutions, and I use that whether it's places of business or bars, or you mentioned the chorus already, but were there any other things that you thought of as kind of cultural touchstones in our history that you were involved in?
No, not well. Yeah, I mean, the only other one was the development of a gay community center, which ended up not coming into reality. There was a group of about a dozen or 15 people, men and women, beginning in the mid 90s, who wanted to create a space where gay groups could meet, could have business meetings, could strategize together, could have social events, could rehearse, a gay play. If there were, after Matthew Shepard was killed, there was talk about doing a production of the play about his murder, which later came to fruition. But a group started meeting to talk about these needs and what resources we had and what support we would get from different institutions like the congregations that were supportive and other, I guess, allied groups. Monroe Gilmore, who at the time was a friend of mine, had been running a nonprofit called WINSEB for 15 years or more, Western North Carolina Citizens for an End to Institutional Bigotry. And it was like an umbrella group for any organization that needed support for women's rights or Hispanic rights or Black rights or women's abortion rights, and certainly GLBT rights. And I think somebody from there also got involved. Jerry Solomon was very active with it at the time. She is now, I think, the spokesperson for the police department or the sheriff's department. But at the time, she was working at a for-profit private company. And I think Jim Kavanagh was involved, at least in the beginning. And I don't remember who else was part of it. But we met every month for well over a year and a half, to try to create a skeleton structure whereby we could make a community center come into being, have a place of its own, develop a budget so that we could afford to pay rent, have activities, promote the organization. And at the time, we were concerned that we'd also have to pay for security for any space we had against vandalism and so forth. And we really got a good way along the path of developing the plan and architecting the design for it. And when we decided to file for nonprofit status as a 501c3, we agreed to do that, I think, under Monroe Gilmore's WINSEB group and get our own 501c3 number. So of course, at that point, we needed a board of directors and founding incorporating officers with the state. And I had been the convener, I guess you'd call it, or the leader of this ongoing committee meeting for a year and a half. And somebody, maybe Kavanagh, said, well, we need to elect a board and elect officers. And I think that the first person who should be on the board and should be our chairman is Andy Reid. And I was like, nope, I've done my work. I have brought you all together. I've brought diverse groups together to discuss it. I think Jerry Connor was involved as well. We've seen what people have brought to the table. And so, you know, you're a fledgling group now. You don't need me. You've got your own leadership. And so I nominated Jerry to be the chairperson of Jerry Solomon to be the chairperson of the board, or the founding president, or whatever the term was we were using. And somebody seconded, and she was chosen. And I said, great, I'm going home now because I've done my work. And so I left. And the organization did continue to meet for a couple more years, but they ultimately did not find the funding or the resources to be able to build a community center. And then I think there was a rethinking of it. This was probably about 99 or so. There was a rethinking of it, and the decision that because there were other organizations like All Souls and like UU, and even the old O. Henry's on, when it was still on Haywood Street downtown near where Malaprops is now, before it moved to where it is now.
Oh.
There were places that people could meet and supportive organizations that would open their doors. And was it worth spending a lot of money to try to create a self-sustaining, narrowly defined, dedicated center just for GLBTQ issues and programs and so forth? And so they decided not to. But other than that, no, I didn't stay involved in many of the queer issues after a certain time. And it was, I think it's because in the same way my parents, I learned this years and years ago, the day I turned 18, my parents cashed in their life insurance policy because I was the youngest of three. And they said, well, you know, once he's 18, he can make it on his own. So we don't need to have a life insurance policy to take care of him. And so they cashed it in. I was pushed out of the nest like a fledgling. And I think I view movements in the same way. It was essential in 1969 to have a riot at the Stonewall Inn. By 1975, it was essential that I walk into a job and put my boyfriend's picture on the desk and be done with it. By 1993 in Asheville, it was essential to shout out loud, I'm here, I'm queer, and pay attention, and I'm not going away, and I'm going to get in your face until you get over it. And after you do that and they get over it, you don't have to shout anymore. And so my view was, after 10 years of being involved in these things in Asheville in various ways, they didn't need me. I didn't need to be a leader. There were other leaders who were perfectly capable of doing what needed to be done. And there was much less needing to be done. So I wanted to just step away and say, go, do your thing. And I'm just going to enjoy singing with the chorus and getting back to my work. I work as an editor and publisher, and so I'm going to get back to my work editing books and so forth, and doing theater. I did a lot of theater. And step away from any GLBTQ activism. So that's what I did probably 15 years ago or more.
Okay. Yeah, with the festival, when Blue Ridge Pride runs the festival, the sort of the identity debate we have every year is that between is the purpose of the festival to be a celebration or is it a protest? And I think throughout the history there have been swings, and in different cities it's swung. Where, just you personally, do you think, where on the spectrum should we be right now?
Well, I think in terms of Asheville itself and in Buncombe County to a lesser degree, it is more a celebration of prideful life. But as long as there are incidents going on about negative repercussions for particularly young people in schools, in high schools, even middle schools, as long as there are negative repercussions for them for being gay or being perceived as gay or appearing gay or what have you, then there has to be a protest against that. But it seems to me, I've been involved with the Martin Luther King Prayer Breakfast for over 20 years. And it is the largest event in Asheville that is biracial or multiracial. And when we do the breakfast at now at the Crown Plaza, it was at the Grove Park Inn before that and the Civic Center before that. It's the only event in Asheville at which the audience is pretty close to 50% Black, 50% white.
Yeah.
And that means that a huge proportion of the Black community has come out and a very small proportion of the white community, but it is a very mixed crowd. And it is generally celebratory. It is the largest event in the South for Martin Luther King's birthday celebration, other than the Atlanta Martin Luther King Center dinner, which attracts like 3,000. We attract over 1,000. And so it is celebratory, but it also is hortatory. And the speaker always and emphasizes the importance of being engaged in the community and focusing on issues where there is still a lot of inequality or what have you. But overall, the breakfast is a time to celebrate and cheer and enjoy. But on that same weekend, we have on the Monday, the March for Peace and Justice, and we have speakers at City County Plaza, and they focus on all the problems that still have to be dealt with. They will focus on Rodney King or Johnny Rush, who was beaten up,
Right.
tased. They will focus on Breonna Taylor and all the deaths that Black Lives Matter has brought to attention. So that is the part of it that is essential for raising awareness, whereas the breakfast is celebratory. And it seems to me that if the Pride Festival or celebration or march or whatever you call it, if it can be maybe 75% celebratory, look at all the organizations. Hey, there's All Souls. There's First Baptist Church with their booth, hooray. And even, Hominy Baptist Church has been involved because they're a very progressive Baptist congregation. And here are all these other groups and so forth. And, services being offered and goods being sold and opportunities to get involved. And all of this is positive stuff. But we got to take 30 minutes or 40 minutes during the morning of Pride to gather people at City County Plaza and speak to the incidents of hate, the incidents of shut doors, the incidents of bigotry, the incidents of not just maltreatment, but unequal treatment by the courts or in the jails or in school programs and so forth. But at the same time, to remember, look how far we've come. Look at who's here. Look at these, grandmothers with their grandchildren, and it's the grandmother who's gay. And oh, that grandmother with her grandson, her son is a 13-year-old who's gay. And that kind of thing. Look at how far we've come. Look at how we have made this world a better place is something to celebrate. We love diversity, we celebrate it. And we even have, the black drag queen in roller skates or what have you, as well as the stodgy little white lady from First Baptist Church, who never in her wildest dreams 50 years ago, when she was a newlywed 22-year-old, would imagine that she would have a friend who was a black drag queen on roller skates. But here they are, and they have become friends. That's something to celebrate. And at the same time, it has to remember, look at all these kids who come here from Rutherford County or from Haywood County or Cherokee or Graham because their father beat them up and kicked them out of the house because they weren't masculine enough or the girl was too butch, and they've been thrown out of their house and they need a place to live. They need an opportunity to live their lives safely. So there has to be that component of it. But I'm wondering if it might be structurally designed so that it is a celebration with a serious moment or a serious core, a serious element.
That's helpful. Well, any final, before we close it out, are there any final thoughts you have?
There is only one, because back in the 90s, or maybe around 2000, I'll tell you a funny story. I was working at Asheville Community Theater as marketing director in 98, 99. And I had bought a new car, and it was a sporty little convertible. And my friend Carol Ensley, since deceased, who was the partner of Ted All, they were both involved with Gay Men's Chorus. I went to visit them and show off my new little red convertible. And I was single at the time and hated it. And Carol said to me, he sang bass in the chorus, and I sang tenor, and he said, "Honey, if you can't get a man with that, you might as well hang it up." So I said, okay, well, if it takes a car to get a man, well, maybe I should hang it up. But it happened that the next Pride Parade was coming up, and I found the perfect cap. I'm a Leo. I was born in August, and so the lion is my thing. And I found a cap to wear for Pride. And that very summer, I got a boyfriend, which was rather nice. And I don't know if the cap had anything to do with it, but I still have this cap 20 some years later, and it's my very favorite one. So I'm going to put it on.
Oh.
It's got the little thing. And if you look, that thing at the top is a lion.
Oh, Lord.
That was my favorite little Pride cap, that's about the extent of Andy being a flamboyant queen, that I'll put on a cap like that, because otherwise I am so stodgy and boring and normal and, white bread hetero seeming person. What I believe is this, and I believed this at NBC 35 years ago. For the ultimate goal of all movements is to be completely normalized and accepted, to be part of the fabric of the community, not to be tolerated, not to be welcomed, but with whispers, but to be so boringly part of the community that nobody even thinks about it anymore. That's the purpose of the gay rights movement. We want to be treated like everybody else. We want to be accepted for who we are. I mean, I remember this from the 60s. We want to be accepted for who we are with no judgments attached. And as that evolved, it meant we want to be able to marry whom we will, and we want to live our lives with exactly the same lack of extra layers of concern as anyone else in the society, as white heterosexual couples do. We should not have to worry about a question like, have you ever felt fear in going out in public?
Right.
Because you're gay, or you're identified as gay, or you're perceived as gay. We should not have to be concerned about saying, this is my husband, or this is my spouse, or this is my wife, or I'm married to Joe. That becomes so normal that even like bureaucratic forms that you fill out, spouse's name, do not assume that you have the same name. It took feminists 40 years to get the right to use their own name on a government form. And I remember when my sister was moving from Alaska to Alberta in Canada, and she was married, the Canadian immigrant officer would not allow her into the country, even though she had been working in Canada as Claudette Reed for 15 years. She had gotten married, and she and her husband had decided to move full-time to Alberta. The immigration officer said, you may not emigrate into Canada unless you take your husband's name. And she was like 43 at the time, and she had to become Claudette Upton in order to emigrate. So that kind of hurdle, you know, she was known across Canada as Claudette Reed, and suddenly Claudette Reed no longer existed. Well, the same thing with same-sex couples. It should be axiomatic that if there's a form that is for a couple, two people in a couple, like a mortgage loan or a government ID form, that it should have space for each individual's name and not simply a shared last name and then wife's name. That should be so much part of the system and the culture that it's not even questioned anymore. And people look back at the old forms and laugh because they were so stupid. So the purpose of the gay rights movement is that the gay rights movement is no longer needed. If we accomplish our goals, we stop existing. And that is the ultimate goal, as far as I'm concerned. So certainly for somebody like me, I spent my 20s and my 30s making sure that for myself and for people I knew and for the communities I was part of in NBC and here and there, that nobody could question my right to be there, my right to participate, my equality, and so forth. And once that was established, it became a non-issue and has been ever since. Once I moved to Asheville, or moved home to Asheville in the 90s, there was still some of that same background work and catch-up work to be done. But once I had contributed what I could, then I was no longer needed for that. And there are still issues. There's another generation that needs, to make sure that those same doors are open. But I have noticed that among high school and middle school students, it's much less of an issue, just like racial prejudice seems to be much less of an issue in high schools and middle schools than it was even 20 years ago or 25 years ago. So that I'm very optimistic that that generation will shed a whole new light on what is normal in America, like the kids from Stoneman Douglas High School in Florida with the anti-gun movement. And so what I hope is that we're getting closer to a point at which you and I are relics of a historical fact that future people will look back on and say, I can't believe they had to go through that. Or that will just die out, and be buried for 100 years. And then somebody say, what? There was a gay rights program? Haven't gay people always been accepted? That would be the ultimate ideal. And from my viewpoint, the African American community faces 100 times worse hurdles than we do as a primarily white GLBTQ community. And so for the last 10 years or so, that's been much more my focus, because I can be of more value as a white ally or participant or member of that community. I'm a member by invitation of that community. I edit the Urban News, which is the African American newspaper in town.
I love that.
Well, I'm the editor of it since its inception. The publisher, Johnny Grant, is a local Asheville woman, and she founded it, gosh, I guess in 2007, and hired me to be the copy editor. And so I'm very involved with that. And with Martin Luther King Prayer Breakfast, I've been involved since '94. Those are things where whatever privileges I have and whatever benefits have accrued to me, whether it's my time or my insight or my connections or my background and my knowledge, can be of use, I can be a foot soldier in the Black civil rights movement to much more effect than I can be in the GLBT movement at this point. So that's where I've got my focus. But I think that what Pride is doing for Western North Carolina, there is still so much to be done, especially in the outer counties. I'm canvassing for Jasmine Beach for her seat, or I guess it's not re-election, but it's election to a new seat now that the district's changed. But just the fact that we have a lesbian county commissioner and a Black sheriff and 2 African Americans on city council and a good likelihood of a third being appointed, that we have an incredibly progressive district attorney, and finally an African American county commissioner. I think that locally, so much has improved and changed in terms of accomplishing that goal of you're seen for what you bring to the table, not who you sleep with.
Right.
Or who you fall in love with. Because what matters is what you bring to the table on this issue. And all the rest of, the Rabbi Hillel in Judea's history was quoted as saying, do not do that to someone else that would be hateful if done to you. From Leviticus, love thy neighbor as thyself. He said, do not do that to someone else that would be hateful if done to you. That is the entire Torah. The rest is commentary. Well, bringing something to the table, whoever you happen to be, if you bring something to the table that's of value, that's what matters. And whether you go home and you're an elderly bald guy or a younger middle-aged-ish woman with long hair, or, you know, part of a biracial couple, gay couple, or what have you, that's irrelevant. What did you bring to the table? And Asheville is getting closer to that, where people bring to the table a variety of perspectives and viewpoints and ideas and challenges and insights, whether it's Jasmine or Al Whiteside's, oh, sorry, I covered up my camera. Jasmine Farrar, Beach Farrar, or Al Whiteside's, or if Kim Roney gets appointed to council. But that is where we want to get to. And so that should always be kept in the forefront. How do we get there? How far have we come towards that goal, and what is still missing? And then focus the energy on fixing the parts that are missing, celebrate how far we've come, and then try to figure out, will there be a way ultimately that we're not needed anymore as a movement?
Right. That would be nice.
That's how I look at it.
This has been fantastic. I'm going to hit the stop button. This is fantastic. I have to, let me just make sure. Do you want to stop cloud recording?